Have you ever accepted an apology even though deep down you knew things would never be the same again? Sometimes forgiveness doesn't come as a relief. It comes too calmly, too silently. And that's exactly how it was that night. He cried, he apologized, he said he was wrong, that he was sorry, that he couldn't bear to lose her. He spoke of a fresh start, of change, of promises that seemed too sincere to be ignored. And she listened to it all in silence. She looked at the man who said he loved her and, with a firm and controlled voice, said she forgave him. At that moment, to an outsider, everything seemed resolved, a marriage saved, a story with a happy ending. But not all forgiveness springs from the same place. While he breathed a sigh of relief, believing he had escaped the consequences, something inside her no longer moved as before. It wasn't anger, it wasn't revenge, it was clarity, a feeling difficult to explain, as if a door had closed from the inside, silently, without warning. Have you ever felt that? That silent certainty that, even staying, you are no longer the same person? She accepted the apology, yes. She prepared dinner, she maintained the routine. She smiled when necessary. For him, that was reconciliation. For her, it was just the beginning of a new way of seeing everything, because there's a huge difference between forgiving and trusting again, and there's an even bigger difference between staying and continuing to belong. Perhaps you've been through something similar. Perhaps you've heard promises that sounded too good to be true at the exact moment when you were too tired to argue. Perhaps you've also thought that insisting was easier than starting over alone. Stories like these don't begin with shouting or slamming doors. They begin with silence, with decisions that no one notices, with women who gradually learn to listen more to their own intuition than to the words of those who always had ready answers. He believed that forgiveness meant forgetting, that those tears had cleansed everything, that simply apologizing was enough to erase the past. And that's where the most common and most fatal mistake lies. Because when a woman forgives after understanding exactly what she lost, that forgiveness doesn't come to save the relationship, it comes to liberate her. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you. Not every reconciliation is a return. Some are just a postponed goodbye. And sometimes the biggest turning point doesn't happen when someone leaves, but when someone stays, watching. She began to notice details she had previously ignored: his tone of voice, his pauses, his overconfidence. She began to realize how he felt too secure, too comfortable, convinced that everything had returned to normal. Little did he know that normal no longer existed. What existed now was a woman in silence, reorganizing everything from the inside, while the world around her continued to believe the same old story. Have you ever been through this? Ever felt like something was over before it was officially over? Many women know this moment well. It's when the heart stops asking for explanations and starts looking for a way out. Not in a hurry, not with a scene, but with a calmness that is frightening. And it is precisely at this point that this story truly begins, because accepting an apology doesn't mean giving up on yourself. Sometimes it means buying time to understand, time to decide, time to do what needs to be done, without fanfare, without warnings, without turning back. And while he slept peacefully, believing he had been forgiven, she no longer slept with the same doubts. Something inside her had changed, and when that happens, no promise in the world can return everything to what it was before. And perhaps that's why stories like this resonate so deeply, because they're not just about a couple or a misunderstood apology. They're about moments when we realize we've grown inside, even while remaining the same on the outside. If at any point up to this point you recognized yourself in a phrase, in a silence, in a swallowed decision, know that you're not alone. Many women experience this kind of apparent reconciliation where the world believes everything has been resolved, while inside something has already been permanently rearranged. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. Sometimes, writing is a way to organize what we've never been able to say out loud. And when you share your experience, your opinion, or even a question, another person may feel understood for the first time. This space exists precisely for that, so that real stories can meet, even anonymously. And if you feel that this content deserves to continue reaching more people who need to hear this kind of story, liking the video makes more of a difference than it seems. It's a simple gesture, but it helps the channel reach those who are experiencing exactly this moment of silent confusion, of internal decisions that no one sees. Your participation here is what keeps this kind of narrative alive. Subscribing to the channel is also a way of saying that you want to continue following stories that speak of dignity, emotional strength, and choices made in silence. Stories that don't shout but remain, that don't romanticize pain but show the path of those who have learned to listen to themselves. Here, every comment, every like, every subscription builds a small community of people who understand that not all change begins with confrontation. Some begin with a simple, "I forgive," said at a moment when nothing more is expected, except self-respect. And while she continued to live that reconciliation that only existed in his head, something much bigger was already in motion. A process that didn't need to be explained, announced, or justified. Because when a woman changes, inside, time starts working in her favor. And what comes after that silence is exactly what you're about to discover. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because before any apology, before the apparent reconciliation, there's a story that almost no one pays attention to. Who was this woman before everything fell apart? And perhaps it's here that you'll begin to recognize yourself in an uncomfortably familiar way. She was always the dedicated type, one of those who believe that relationships are built day by day with presence, care, and patience. She didn't like conflict, not because she was weak, but because she believed that talking was better than confronting. She preferred to adjust her tone, give in a little, wait for the right moment. She learned early on that love was a joint effort, that marriage wasn't a fairy tale, but a commitment. And she took that seriously, so seriously that many times she put her own needs second without realizing it. She believed in marriage as one believes in a life project. She didn't see her husband as an enemy, but as a partner. When something wasn't going well, she thought it was just a phase, stress, a passing problem. She justified actions, interpreted silences, softened harsh words. She told herself that nobody is perfect, that everyone makes mistakes, that loving also means understanding. And so, little by little, she molded herself to fit into that space that seemed increasingly cramped. She was a conciliator, the kind who tries to maintain peace even when she feels discomfort growing inside. If something bothered her, she thought twice before speaking. Is it worth discussing this now? Am I exaggerating? These questions became routine, not because she lacked a voice, but because she believed that true love would know how to listen without needing to raise her voice. But over time, she began to realize that speaking less didn't mean being heard. This woman believed that if she were better, more patient, more understanding, things would work themselves out. She believed that dedication generates rewards, that loyalty inspires loyalty. And when small disappointments arose, she preferred to think of them as exceptions, not signs. This didn't make her naive, it made her human. It made her someone who chose to trust, because living in distrust of those you love is exhausting. Behind the scenes of this story, while everyone saw a calm woman, there was someone making daily choices. Choices. To stay, to try, to persevere. She didn't wake up one day deciding to give up. It happened gradually, in the name of harmony, family, the idea that giving up would mean failure. And perhaps you've experienced something similar. Perhaps you too have believed that loving meant enduring a little longer. She avoided conflict because she believed maturity meant knowing how to let things go. But nobody teaches you that letting things go too much comes at a price. Nobody warns you that, at some point in the journey, the bill comes due. And when it does, it doesn't come in the form of an explosion. It comes in the form of clarity, a silent, cold clarity, impossible to ignore. This woman wasn't weak. She was committed. She wasn't blind. She was hopeful. And that makes all the difference, because there's a very fine line between believing and losing yourself. And she walked that line long enough to know exactly when something inside her began to change. It wasn't a big event. It was a detail, a repeated gesture, a thoughtless phrase, something that made too much sense to ignore. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a change of mindset, a slow, almost invisible realization. She began to understand that postponed decisions are still decisions, that constant silence also communicates, and that love without respect becomes just routine disguised as commitment. This understanding didn't leave her bitter. It left her lucid. While everyone around her believed she was just the same devoted wife as always, something new was forming inside. An inner journey of self-discovery, a reassessment of boundaries, a rediscovery of her own voice. She still believed in the marriage, yes, but he no longer believed he needed to erase himself to keep it. That was the hidden truth that began to change everything. And that's why, when the apology came, he found someone different, not a resentful woman, nor a cold one, nor a distant one. He found someone who had already understood too, much to go back to square one. Someone who had seen the behind the scenes of their own relationship with more attentive eyes. Someone who realized the impact of small decisions ignored over time. Perhaps this is where this story resonates with yours, because many women don't change when they yell. They change when they stop justifying. They change when they understand that loving shouldn't require disappearing. And when that realization hits, nothing goes back exactly to the way it was before. The setting may seem the same, but the person who inhabits that space is no longer the same. Comment below, "This makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding his behavior is essential to understanding why the breakup didn't happen suddenly, but rather formed gradually behind the scenes of everyday life. There wasn't a big scandal, nor a memorable scene. What happened was something more difficult to explain, and precisely for that reason, more painful, an accumulation of small absences that together began to weigh too heavily. At first, they were almost imperceptible details. A delay without warning, a gaze that no longer met hers, conversations interrupted by text messages. Nothing that in isolation justified a confrontation. She thought it was a phase, tiredness, work pressure. She decided to let it go. But letting it go became a habit, and the habit turned into silence. Her mindset was still that of someone who believes patience solves everything, that persisting carefully is a form of love. The words began to change tone. They weren't shouts, they were ironic remarks. Comments thrown in casually, but which echoed inside. Observations about how she was too sensitive, dramatic, difficult to please. Phrases said in public with a smile on her face that diminished her slightly in the eyes of others. Small humiliations disguised as jokes. The kind of thing that, if she complained, would become an exaggeration. So she swallowed it. And each time she swallowed it, something rearranged itself inside her. The neglect manifested itself in simple ways. He didn't ask how her day was. He didn't notice when she was too quiet. He didn't notice obvious changes. And when he did notice, he treated them as irrelevant. Emotional absence doesn't shout, it whispers. And that's why it goes unnoticed by those who don't want to hear. She was still there, present, doing her part. He was there too, physically, but the connection no longer happened in the same place. Behind the scenes of this relationship, decisions began to weigh more than words. He chose not to listen. He chose not to delve deeper. I chose to continue as if everything was fine because that was more comfortable. And she chose to understand once again. She chose to wait. She chose not to create conflict. But every choice has an impact, and the impact of this imbalance began to show in how she felt within her own home. It wasn't that he was overtly cruel. That would have been easier to identify. The problem lay in the cold, everyday routine, the lack of care, the normalization of subtle disrespect. She began to feel alone, even when accompanied. She started to wonder if she was asking too much by expecting attention, consideration, presence, and when a woman begins to question whether she deserves the basics, something is already profoundly wrong. The revelations didn't come in the form of confessions. They came in the form of repetition, always the same posture, the same indifference, the same ease in moving forward without looking back, and each repetition was a silent message. The hidden truth wasn't in what he said, but in what he failed to do, in what he chose not to see, in what he didn't care to correct. She tried to talk, not once, not twice, calm, mature conversations without accusations. She spoke about how she felt, about the distance, about the need for change. He listened, agreed at the moment, promised to adjust. And for a while it seemed he was really going to try, but soon everything went back to normal. And this cycle is exhausting, because it creates hope only to shatter it soon after. Her transformation began precisely there, not when he made his first mistake, but when she realized he wouldn't change despite understanding. That changes everything, because when someone understands the impact of their own behavior and still chooses to continue, the message is clear. And that clarity hurts more than any harsh words. She began to observe more than react. She started noticing patterns, not isolated episodes. She began to understand that the problem wasn't a bad day, but an entire journey of choices that no longer included self-care. This realization was silent but definitive. There was no emotional explosion. There was an internal reorganization, a change of mindset that happens when hope begins to give way to lucidity. He didn't notice this shift. To him, everything was within acceptable limits. After all, there were no fights, no scandals, and that's where one of the biggest traps lies, confusing the absence of conflict with the presence of a bond. While he believed everything was under control, she had already begun to distance herself internally, not out of coldness, but out of self-preservation. This phase was crucial, because it was during this period that she began to understand her own worth outside of that dynamic. He began to realize that he deserved more than emotional crumbs, that love shouldn't hurt in small, constant doses, that her journey didn't need to continue that way. These revelations didn't transform her into a different person overnight, but they prepared the ground for decisions that were yet to come. And when the apology finally came, he found someone who had seen too much to believe in words alone. He found a woman who knew the inner workings of her own pain, who had measured the impact of every act of neglect, every harsh word, every absence, and that knowledge changes the way one listens to any promise. Write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this matter." Because the day he apologized wasn't just an isolated moment. It was a clear reflection of everything that had been happening behind the scenes. It wasn't a spontaneous conversation. It was a carefully constructed scene, almost rehearsed, as if he had spent hours choosing words that sounded right, confident, convincing. His tone of voice was low, controlled, imbued with a calmness that tried to appear mature. He spoke slowly, as if measuring each sentence to avoid mistakes. And in that calculated rhythm, there was more fear than regret. He began by acknowledging flaws in a general way. He said that he wasn't being the best version of himself, that work had taken over, that he didn't realize how distant he was. Promises followed one after another, neatly organized, almost like a mental checklist. He would change, he would try harder, he would truly listen, he would prioritize the marriage. There were restrained tears, a long sigh mid-speech, strategic pauses to observe her reaction. The speech seemed honest, but it had something excessively correct about it, as if it had been tested beforehand in the mirror. She listened attentively to everything. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. She didn't point out inconsistencies. While he spoke, she observed not only what was being said, but what lay behind it. The fear of losing her appeared in the details, in the handshake, in the gaze seeking approval, in the haste to assure him that now things would be different. It wasn't just an apology, it was an attempt to regain control of the situation, because at that point in the journey, he already felt that something was slipping away. He needed forgiveness, like someone needs a safe haven. He needed to believe that everything would return to normal, that this conversation would close an uncomfortable chapter. The impact of losing her seemed greater than the impact of having hurt her. And this difference, though subtle, completely changes the interpretation of the scene. She perceived this, not with anger, but with clarity. A clarity that only comes when the mindset has already changed. When it was her turn to speak, there was no long speech. There were no accumulated accusations. She didn't bring up a list of mistakes, nor did she relive past episodes. She said few words. She said she accepted the apologies. She said she believed everyone makes mistakes. She said she was willing to try to move forward. The tone was serene, almost neutral. To him, it sounded like relief, like confirmation that the plan had worked. He took a deep breath, relaxed his shoulders, and allowed himself to smile again. What he didn't realize was the silent shift that had already occurred. Because accepting apologies doesn't mean restoring the emotional place someone occupied before. And she knew that. She knew that forgiveness didn't erase the revelations she had experienced in the previous months. She knew that promises, however beautiful, didn't undo the impact of repeated choices. Forgiveness there wasn't a return to the past. It was a conscious decision to move forward without illusory expectations. Behind the scenes of this apparent reconciliation, something important happened. She stopped expecting. And when someone stops expecting, the power dynamic changes completely. He spoke of rebuilding, believing that everything would be as before. She listened, knowing that rebuilding, if it existed, would come from somewhere else. A place where she no longer depended emotionally on his change to feel whole. His fear of losing was evident, fear of being alone, fear of being seen as responsible, fear of facing the consequences. His apology was laden with this fear. Her forgiveness, however, was laden with something else, lucidity, a lucidity that didn't need to be announced or explained. It was there, present, firm, and that's what makes this scene so revealing. Two people experiencing the same moment from completely different perspectives. While he believed he was closing a cycle, she was merely acknowledging where it ended. Her inner journey had already progressed several steps forward. The most important decisions weren't spoken in that conversation. They had already been made in silence, over sleepless nights, solitary, reflections and small revelations that accumulate until they form a truth impossible to ignore. This apology marked a before and after, but not in the way he imagined. For him, it was the end of the conflict. For her, it was confirmation of everything she had already understood about that relationship. And when that happens, no promise can reverse the impact. Because forgiveness, when it arises from clarity, is not an innocent new beginning. It's a transition. She emerged from that conversation, seemingly lighter, calmer, more present. He believed he had regained his balance, but inside, she was already in a different emotional place. A place where decisions would be guided by her own truth, not by the hope of change from others. And it is in this silent space that the next choices begin to take shape, almost imperceptibly, while everything around seems too normal. Comment below, "This makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this matter, because the most important decision in this story wasn't spoken aloud. It didn't happen in the conversation, it didn't appear in the carefully chosen words, nor in the moment she said she accepted the apology. The real decision happened in silence, and silent decisions are often the most definitive. When she accepted the apology, there was no fight, there was no argument, there were no demands, conditions or lists of what needed to change. She didn't ask for proof, she didn't ask for guarantees, she didn't ask for additional promises. To an outside observer, it seemed like emotional maturity. It seemed like balance. It even seemed like the relationship was evolving. But inside, the movement was different. A deeper, more internal movement, harder to perceive. The forgiveness she offered didn't come from the same place as before. Before, forgiveness meant hope. It meant believing that it would be enough to rebuild everything. Now, forgiveness came from accepting reality, and that completely changes the impact. Because when someone forgives after seeing the hidden truth of a relationship, that forgiveness doesn't carry expectation, it carries clarity. She didn't raise her voice because she no longer felt the need to convince. She didn't argue because she no longer expected to be understood. She didn't demand anything because she had already understood that real change doesn't happen through demands, but through choice. And at that point in the journey, she already knew that his choice was no longer under her control. This understanding brought a different kind of calm, a calm that doesn't come from trusting the other person, but from trusting herself. Behind the scenes of this silent decision, something important was reorganized. She began to observe herself more closely, noticing how she felt around him, observing the impact of his words, gestures, and absences. She began to evaluate her own mindset, the concessions made over time, the decisions postponed. It wasn't a dramatic process. It was almost clinical, a kind of emotional analysis that arises when the heart has grown tired of trying to solve everything alone. Accepting the apologies without confrontation was, for her, a way to buy time. Time to think, to observe, to decide more clearly. It wasn't manipulation nor a game. It was self-preservation. When a woman understands that she no longer needs to prove anything, she begins to act differently. And this often confuses those who expect predictable reactions. He interpreted that silence as peace, as a sign that everything was resolved. He returned to his routine more calmly, believing that the worst was over. What he didn't realize was that the dynamic had changed. Before, she reacted. Now, she observed. Before, she tried to adjust the relationship. Now, she evaluated the impact of the relationship on herself. This change in posture is subtle, but powerful. The forgiveness she offered wasn't an invitation to start over from scratch. It was a decision to no longer harbor resentment while she reorganized her own boundaries. Because there's a huge difference between forgiving and putting yourself back in the same emotional position. And she knew that. She knew that if something were rebuilt, it wouldn't be on the same terms. And perhaps it wouldn't even be rebuilt at all. This was the quietest transformation in the whole story. She stopped explaining herself. She stopped justifying her feelings. She stopped blaming herself for expecting the basics. She began to see the relationship with more emotional distance, like someone observing a situation from the outside for the first time. And when that happens, decisions cease to be impulsive. They become strategic, even if they aren't planned in detail. The impact of this type of decision isn't immediate. It manifests itself gradually in restrained gestures, shorter answers, and the absence of emotional urgency. She was still present, but no longer available in the same way. She was still there, but she no longer molded herself to fit in. This difference is almost imperceptible to those who aren't paying attention, and he wasn't. While he believed that forgiveness had restored everything, she had already changed her internal perspective. Her journey continued in silence, fueled by small daily revelations. Every action of his, after that apology, began to be observed with different eyes, not to find fault, but to confirm truths she had already understood. This kind of Forgiveness doesn't make a fuss. It doesn't create scenes. It doesn't demand applause. It simply redefines the terrain. And those who don't perceive this redefinition continue walking as if nothing has changed, until the moment they understand too late that the ground is no longer the same. And it is precisely at this point that the story gains a new layer, because from this silent decision, everything that happens begins to have a different weight, a different meaning. What would have been ignored before is now recorded. What would have been overlooked before is now analyzed. What would have been tolerated before is now evaluated in the light of a new inner truth. Write in the comments, "This makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because after the silent decision she made, something curious began to happen. Normal life returned, at least on the surface. Dinners resumed at the same time. Conversations about the day, about bills, about future plans, reappeared. The routine reorganized itself as if that apology had truly put everything back in its place. For him, the reconciliation was complete. The problem is that it only existed on his side. He began to act as if he believed he had overcome a crisis. There was a new lightness in his behavior, an almost comfortable security. He sat at the table talking about trivial matters, commented on work, made simple plans for the weekend. Everything seemed to be flowing as before, and she kept up. She answered when asked, smiled when expected, kept the household running smoothly. To any outsider, that couple had overcome a difficult phase, but the hidden truth lay in the details. Inside, something no longer moved in the same way. She was there, but not fully engaged. She was present, but not involved as before. While he spoke, she listened with a different kind of attention, not to agree or disagree, but to observe. She observed the tone, the coherence between words and actions, the repetition of patterns. She began to listen more than she spoke because she understood that when someone talks too much, they end up revealing themselves without realizing it. Behind the scenes of this new routine, her mindset had already changed. She no longer sought validation in small acts of kindness. She wasn't swayed by vague promises. She didn't create exaggerated expectations about sudden changes. Each gesture was simply another piece of information in a broader understanding of the situation. This quiet demeanor didn't stem from coldness, but from clarity, a clarity that arises when the inner transformation has already taken place. Dinners, for example, continued to happen, but before, she used those moments to try to connect, to bring up topics, to create closeness. Now, she observed the space between one word and another. She noticed when he only talked about himself. She noticed when certain questions didn't come. And this didn't hurt her as before. It only confirmed what she had already understood throughout the journey. The emotional absence, even amidst the routine, was becoming increasingly evident. The conversations also changed in weight. He spoke believing he was being heard, as before. She listened, but without the urgency to respond. She spoke less, not out of fear, but by choice. When she spoke, she was objective. She didn't over-explain. She didn't try to convince. This change is almost invisible but powerful, because when someone stops explaining themselves, it makes it clear that something internal has already been resolved. She began to realize that reconciliation was comfortable for him because it didn't require real change. He simply had to continue the routine, maintain the appearance of normalcy, and everything would be fine. For her, however, that normalcy was no longer satisfying. Not because she expected perfection, but because she began to see the impact of constantly adjusting herself to maintain someone else's equilibrium. This phase was marked by silent observation. She noticed how he felt too secure, too confident that everything had returned to normal. She noticed how he didn't perceive the subtle distancing. She noticed how small actions were still repeated, even after the promises. And each repetition functioned as an internal confirmation, not as a disappointment. The difference is crucial, because disappointment still carries expectation. Confirmation brings closure. She didn't confront. She didn't point fingers. She didn't demand anything, and that, in a way, confused him. For him, the absence of conflict was a sign of success. For her, it was simply space to think more clearly. Her emotional journey was proceeding at a different pace, a slower, more conscious, less impulsive pace. Decisions began to mature in silence, without haste, without fanfare. This reconciliation, which only existed for him, created a subtle power shift. Before, she struggled to keep the relationship working. Now, she merely observed whether that relationship made sense for who she had become. And when someone reaches this point in their journey, the dynamic changes completely. The bond ceases to be a necessity and becomes a choice under consideration. She realized she was on a different emotional level when she noticed she no longer felt anxious about pleasing others. She didn't feel guilty for not being as involved as before. She wasn't afraid of being alone within her own decision. This didn't happen dramatically. It was a silent transformation, built day by day, behind the scenes of her seemingly normal routine. Meanwhile, he continued to believe that everything was resolved. He made plans, talked about the future, made comments as if the past were closed, and she listened with the tranquility of someone who is no longer easily deceived. There was no sarcasm, no irony. There was only a healthy emotional distance, which allows one to clearly see the real impact of actions, not just words. This phase is uncomfortable precisely because it lacks dramatic scenes. There are no screams or tears. There is silence, observation, and decisions being formed slowly. It is here that many stories are defined, even without anyone realizing it. It is here that the hidden truth begins to take concrete form, even before any external revelation. And as the days passed, that seemingly restored routine began to reveal more than it concealed. Each dinner, each conversation, each daily gesture functioned as a silent mirror, reflecting what was still intact and what would never be the same again. And she remained there, calm, present, but no longer bound by the same expectations as before, allowing time to show, with precision, everything that needed to be seen. Write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the real turning point in this story wasn't a confrontation, nor an explosive discovery. It was a silent mistake. His mistake was believing that everything had returned to normal. And when someone believes that too early, they start behaving like they've already won, even without realizing that the ground has shifted beneath their own feet. After the apparent reconciliation, he relaxed, not in an obvious way, but in that subtle way of someone who lets their guard down. The attention that had reappeared for a few days began to fade. Care became the exception. Attentive listening became an automatic response. Effort gave way to comfortable routine. He began to act as if the apology had closed the matter, as if the story had been reset. And it was precisely then that the imbalance became clearer. Over time, he became careless again. Small things reappeared almost reflexively, unannounced delays, disappointing comments, decisions made without consulting her. Nothing scandalous, nothing that justified an open fight, but enough to reveal that the promised change hadn't taken root. The impact of these actions this time wasn't immediate pain, it was confirmation, and confirmation has a different weight. He also began to open up more. He spoke more freely, made inappropriate jokes, and let slip opinions he had previously held back. He trusted her silence too much. He interpreted her lack of questioning as agreement. He believed her tranquility was a sign of stability, when in reality it was a sign of observation. This type of mistake is common, confusing silence with passivity when often it is simply a strategy. Behind the scenes of this dynamic, something was being prepared, not in the sense of a calculated plan, but in the sense of a well-considered decision. His every action was internally recorded. Every slip-up was placed alongside the promises made. Every unnecessary exposure revealed more than he imagined, and she observed everything with a calmness that didn't match her past. She didn't react, didn't correct, didn't warn. She simply let it happen. This is the part that often goes unnoticed by those who are too comfortable. When someone stops reacting, they also stop trying to control the outcome. She no longer felt the urgency to adjust the relationship in real time. She no longer feared conflict. She no longer felt the need to prove anything. Her mindset had changed, and he didn't notice. He continued moving as before, without realizing that the emotional space between them was being redefined. He underestimated her silence. He thought it was acceptance. He thought it was maturity. He thought it was peace. He didn't realize that the silence was accompanied by a sharper attention. She listened to everything, observed everything, and above all, she compared. She compared words with actions, promises with behaviors, intentions with results. This constant comparison didn't make her tense, it made her clear. Anticipation begins to build right here, because the audience senses that something is being built beneath the surface. Nothing happens abruptly, but everything points to an inevitable consequence. He continues to relax, believing that the risk has passed. She continues to observe, understanding that the risk was never the conflict, it was the repetition. While he felt secure, she felt increasingly certain, and certainty is a silent place. It doesn't need to be defended or explained. Her journey progressed quietly, sustained by small daily revelations. Each of his gestures functioned as another piece fitting into a larger picture. And when the picture begins to make sense, decisions cease to be emotional and become conscious. He didn't realize that by returning to normal, he was revealing exactly what she needed to see, because normal for him was too comfortable. It was a space where there was no real accountability, no profound transformation, and for her, that normal was no longer enough. Not because of excessive demands, but because clarity doesn't allow for feigned regression. This phase is marked by a false calm. Everything seems stable, predictable, organized, but underneath there is movement. There is calculated impact, boundaries being redefined, choices being matured. There is no rush, there is no anxiety, there is only time working in favor of those who are attentive. And she was. He believed her silence was a sign that he had been completely forgiven. He didn't understand that forgiveness didn't come with forgetting. He didn't realize that the silence wasn't empty, it was full of observation. And the more he exposed himself, the more comfortable he became being exactly who he always was, the more evident the distance became between what he promised and what he delivered. This is the anticipation that captivates, because the audience senses that something is going to happen, even without knowing when or how. The feeling that their mistake isn't in something grandiose, but in believing too soon that everything was resolved, in underestimating the internal transformation of someone who no longer reacts as before, in not realizing that silence is sometimes the greatest sign that something has changed. And while he continued living as if the chapter were closed, she continued observing the details that no one else saw. Every slip-up, every exposure, every moment of excessive relaxation added weight to the decisions that were already being formed. There was no confrontation in sight, but there was a consequence approaching, built with patience, clarity, and a lucidity that makes no noise. Comment below. This makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this matter, because the most important truth in this story didn't come as a shock. It wasn't accompanied by arguments, accusations, or dramatic scenes. The truth happened while everything seemed too calm, and that's precisely why he didn't realize when it happened. While he continued to live under the false impression of normalcy, something had already been decided, not on that specific day, nor during a single sleepless night. The decision was being built up little by little, silently behind the scenes of his routine. Each slip-up on his part, each repeated promise without real change, each unnecessary exposure, helped push that decision into an increasingly solid place. When it finally took shape, it was no longer emotional, it was practical. She didn't announce anything. She didn't ask for opinions. She didn't make threats. She simply began to act differently in small details that would go unnoticed by anyone who wasn't paying attention. A short conversation here, a piece of information sought there, nothing that would raise suspicions. There was no urgency because there was no more anxiety. Her mindset was already operating at a different pace, more rational, more strategic, more aware of the impact of each step. At some point in this silent journey, a document was signed, not as an impulsive act, but as a natural consequence of everything that had been observed up to that point. There was no anger. In signing, there was no feeling of victory. There was clarity. That paper did not represent revenge. It represented alignment with the truth she had already accepted internally. It was the materialization of a decision that was already mature. The plan that was forming didn't involve confrontation, because confrontation presupposes an expectation of change in the other person, and she was no longer in that position. It didn't involve public exposure, because it wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about protecting her own emotional, financial, and psychological integrity. It was about leaving a dynamic without having to convince those who never wanted to see it. He didn't understand why he remained stuck on the idea that everything could be resolved with words. He believed the apology was the final straw. He didn't realize that, for her, it had only been a point of confirmation. While he remained relaxed and confident, she silently moved forward with decisions that no longer depended on his validation. The hidden truth of this phase is that when a woman reaches this level of clarity, she no longer needs permission to move forward. She doesn't ask for emotional leave. She simply organizes her own life in a way that is consistent with who she has become. And this happens quietly, without drama, without spectacle. The greatest transformation is rarely visible on the outside. He kept making superficial plans, commenting on the future as if it were obvious she would be there. He didn't realize that deep down, she no longer saw herself in that scenario in the same way. Not because she harbored hatred, but because she no longer recognized herself in that version of herself that needed to adapt all the time. Her journey had moved beyond trying to save something on her own. The signed document was merely a technical detail within something much larger. The real movement had been internal, the change in mindset, the revision of boundaries, the acceptance that some stories don't end with true reconciliation, only with silent closure. This didn't make her cold. It made her honest with herself. The impact of this type of decision is not immediate. It accumulates. It reveals itself little by little. While he believed he was safe, she was already at peace with the choice she had made. And when someone is at peace with a decision, they don't feel the need to justify it. They simply move on. This is the kind of tranquility that is often mistaken for submission, when in fact it is autonomy. She wasn't planning on hurting anyone. She was preparing herself to emerge unscathed. That difference changes everything, because revenge demands constant emotional energy. Consequences simply happen. And what was being built there was a direct consequence of repeated choices, empty promises, and prolonged emotional absence. Nothing more, nothing less. He didn't realize the exact moment when everything changed, because he was only paying attention to the surface. He didn't see that, while he was talking, she had already stopped internally negotiating. He didn't see that, while he relaxed, she was structuring her own path. He didn't see that her silence wasn't empty, but full of completed decisions. This is one of the hardest truths to accept. Not every breakup begins with a visible rupture. Some begin when someone finally accepts that they can no longer sustain alone what should have been built together. And when that acceptance happens, the rest is just logistics. From that point on, every conversation, every everyday gesture, every small detail takes on a different meaning. There is no more naivete, only observation. There is no more attempt to save, only coherence. The setting still seems the same, but the emotional center of the story has already shifted, and it is in this silent shift that everything begins to move towards an inevitable conclusion, even if it is not yet visible to those who believe that nothing has changed. Write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the moment he discovers it was too late doesn't arrive like an earthquake. There are no screams, no dramatic scenes, no desperate pleas. The discovery comes in the most disconcerting way possible, simple, almost commonplace, and that's precisely what makes everything so definitive. It was a short conversation, one of those that don't drag on because they no longer need to. He noticed something different in her tone, not cold but firm, a tranquility that didn't match their past discussions. She spoke little, choosing her words carefully, as if she already knew exactly where she wanted to go. There was no room for debate. There was no space for negotiation. There was information, and information changes everything. He tried to react in the way that had always worked before. He asked questions, sought arguments, reminded her of promises. But he quickly realized that something didn't add up. She wasn't rushing to answer. She wasn't justifying herself. She didn't seem nervous. On the contrary, she seemed at peace. And when someone is at peace in a difficult conversation, it dismantles any attempt at control. Perhaps it was a letter left in a simple place without drama, not an emotional farewell, but a clear, direct text, almost too respectful. Words chosen not to hurt, but to bring closure. She didn't speak of the past with anger. She spoke of the present with clarity. She explained decisions, not feelings. She pointed out paths already taken, not future possibilities. The letter didn't ask for understanding, it only informed. Or perhaps it was information that arrived too late, a document delivered, a date already set, a practical detail that left no room for doubt, something that didn't need explaining because it was already done. He realized then that it was no longer about convincing, but about accepting. The feeling was strange because there was no conflict to overcome. There was no mistake to correct. There was only consequence. The impact of that moment didn't come from the shock, but from the absence of alternatives. He understood in that silent instant that no conversation could change the course of things. Not because she was closed to dialogue, but because dialogue had already served its purpose long before. The decisions had been matured in silence, behind the scenes, while he believed everything was under control. He tried to find in her eyes some sign of doubt, some trace of the woman who used to give in, reconsider, give another chance. He found none. He found respect, but not dependence. He found calm, but not attachment. He found someone who had undergone a profound transformation and no longer needed to explain herself to feel safe. This is the hardest moment to accept for those who underestimate silence. Because silence doesn't announce when it's finished deciding, it simply stops asking. And when someone stops asking, they also stop negotiating. She wasn't there to be convinced. She was there to communicate an already established reality. He realized he had missed the window of opportunity for promises, that the words that now came with such urgency would have made a difference months before. He realized that the apology, which he believed to be the final straw, had only been an internal turning point for her, a point from which she stopped waiting. And when the waiting ends, the other person's power disappears. The conversation ended without drama, perhaps even with too much politeness. She didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. She didn't need to list mistakes to justify her choices. The impact came precisely from that attitude. There was no more raw emotion, only clarity. There was no more hope placed in her, only decisions made. He stood there trying to understand at what point everything had slipped away. He mentally replayed recent scenes, words spoken, gestures ignored. He tried to find the exact moment of the turning point. He couldn't, because the turning point wasn't an isolated moment. It was an entire journey of small choices, small absences, small repetitions that together made that outcome inevitable. She left that conversation without haste, without needing to explain anything further, because whoever reaches that point has already made peace with their own truth. And when that happens, there's no possible negotiation. Not out of harshness, but out of consistency. She wasn't running away, she was moving forward. This kind of discovery hurts in a different way. It's not the pain of sudden abandonment. It's the pain of realizing that someone has changed while you believed everything was the same. It's the pain of understanding that the mistake wasn't a specific act, but a sequence of normalized oversights. And this pain comes accompanied by something even harder to swallow, the impossibility of going back. While he was trying to process what had happened, she was already several steps ahead, emotionally, not in terms of advantage, but in alignment with herself. The path she had chosen didn't need validation, just to be followed, and that made any attempt to reclaim the past futile. This moment marks a silent transition, where what was once a relationship becomes just part of a story that has run its course. Nothing explodes, nothing collapses immediately, but something ends definitively. And it is from this calm ending that other revelations begin to emerge, revelations that concern not only the end, but what is built afterward, far from the noise, far from old expectations, far from the need to prove anything. Comment below. This makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what happens after he understands it was too late isn't an emotional explosion. It's a silent repositioning, and this kind of closure is often the most powerful of all. There are no winners celebrating, nor losers begging. There are just two people in very different places on their own journey. She finds peace, not because everything was easy, nor because it didn't hurt. Her peace comes from inner alignment. It comes from no longer being in conflict with herself. For a long time, she tried to reconcile what she felt with what she accepted. She tried to justify actions, overlook absences, adapt expectations. Now, no. Now, her decisions make sense for who she has become. And when that happens, silence ceases to be heavy and becomes light. This peace is not euphoria. It's not exaggerated relief. It's tranquility. It's sleeping without needing to rehearse conversations. It's waking up without that tightness in your chest. It's no longer needing to interpret the smallest gestures as signs of hope. Behind the scenes of this transformation, she rebuilt something fundamental, her own confidence. Not confidence in others, but in herself, in her own perception, in her own interpretation of reality. He, on the other hand, is confused, not because he was attacked, but because he lost control of the narrative. For a long time, he believed that things resolved themselves when he decided to speak, promise, explain. Now he realizes that the most important decisions happened without him noticing. And this confusion doesn't stem from the sudden abandonment, but from the realization that he was too late to change course. The power shift happens precisely there, not through shouting, not through imposition, not through humiliation. The shift occurs when she no longer needs him to understand, when she stops waiting for validation, when she moves forward without resentment, but also without illusion. Power changes hands when someone stops begging for consistency from the other and starts living their own. He tries to organize the facts. He searches for explanations, revisits conversations, tries to find the exact point where everything changed. But he can't find it, because the turning point wasn't a single moment, it was a sequence. A journey of small revelations, of accumulated impacts, of truths accepted in silence. And this kind of turning point offers no chance of return because it doesn't depend on momentary emotion. It depends on awareness. She doesn't need to prove anything. She doesn't need to show strength or exaggerated independence. Her posture says it all. Calm, centered, firm. There's no need for revenge because there are no more open wounds. What existed has been understood, processed and closed. That's emotional justice, not the kind that humiliates the other, but the kind that restores dignity to someone who spent too much time diminishing themselves to keep something standing. The implicit message of this story is simple, yet profound. Forgiving is not the same as forgetting who you have become. Forgiveness can exist without the relationship continuing. It can exist without the emotional access being the same. It can exist as a gesture of closure, not of permanence. And that doesn't make someone cold or insensitive. It makes someone conscious. She didn't emerge from this story as a heroine, nor he as a caricatured villain. They emerged as people at different stages of awareness. She understood sooner, he understood later. This difference in timing changes everything. Because whoever understands sooner has the chance to choose calmly. Whoever understands later has to deal with the consequences. And while he is still trying to come to terms with the loss of a place he thought was secure, she is already at another point in her own journey. A point where she no longer needs to smile out of obligation, where she doesn't need to rebuild herself in silence because the rebuilding has already happened. Where the past doesn't weigh her down, it only teaches her. Where the future doesn't frighten her, it only opens up. This type of closure doesn't just end a relationship, it closes an internal cycle, an old mindset, a way of loving that demanded self-abandonment. From here, other decisions begin to take shape, not as an escape, but as a continuation of a transformation that began a long time ago. If you've ever been through something similar, or know someone who needed to smile while rebuilding themselves internally, leave a comment here. Stories like this aren't about revenge. They're about dignity, awareness, and respect for who you've become along the way. Comment below. That makes sense to me. And if you've made it this far, it's because this story resonated with you on some level. Perhaps not through the details, but through the feeling. Through the silence, through the way certain decisions are made internally before they manifest externally. This type of content exists precisely for those who understand that not every turning point makes a sound, and that emotional growth is often an invisible process for those on the outside. If these reflections resonated with you, if they touched on something in your own journey, subscribing to the channel is a simple way to continue following stories that help to organize feelings, clarify thoughts, and see situations with more clarity. Here, the idea is not to judge or romanticize pain, but to share narratives that bring understanding and strengthen those who listen. If you want, leave a comment saying, "This message was for me," or "I'm with you until the end." Knowing that you've stayed this far helps create this space for exchange, where many people realize they're not alone in processes like this. And if, throughout the video, you felt a connection, identification, or even that reflective silence that lingers after a good conversation, a like comes almost as a nod saying, "That made sense." It helps this type of content continue reaching more people who may be experiencing something similar right now. There's a video over here that complements this topic and delves even deeper into this reflection. Click on it and continue reading with me. There. Sometimes one story leads to another, and each one reveals something new about ourselves as well.